Everyone who has a favorite genre of games, be it RPGs, racing games, or sports games, will admit that there are some types of those games that aren't as big of their cup of tea as others. For me, I love RPGs. My favorites are turn-based RPGs and action RPGs. One of the lower genres, or subgenres I should say, is the dungeon RPG genre. The first-person dungeon exploration RPG genre. Etrian Odyssey and Demon Gaze. I loved Demon Gaze, I loved Make You from Idea Factory International. Wasn't really a fan of Dungeon Travelers 2. But we've got a new dungeon RPG from Idea Factory International and Compile Heart. And I'm ready to do a review. So, here is my PlayStation Vita and PlayStation TV review of Mary Skelter Nightmares. Mary Skelter takes place in a city of Japan after it's hit by a disaster with the appearance of a giant living tower that transformed the city and all of the people inside of it into monsters. The survivors are left running for their lives, being hunted by these monsters or being captured and tortured by them. The actual plot surrounds two survivors of the torture. Jack and Alice are childhood friends that are carriers of special blood types that allows them to fight back against the monsters. After being found and recruited by a group of so-called blood maidens that also share the ability to fight back, Jack and Alice assist in trying to take out the tower so everybody can escape from this nightmarish place dubbed the Jail. Now, I think the story of Mary Skelter is unique because it's so different from all the other dungeon RPGs I've played. You've got fantasy setting RPG after fantasy setting RPG after fantasy setting RPG. Mary Skelter takes a post-apocalyptic scenario and has a very dark, gritty tone. And it's really just different. Not to mention the fact that all of the main playable characters are based off of folklore and fairy tales, like Princess Kaguya from Japan folklore, Thumbelina, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty. All of these come together and really help the game stand out. As I explained in the intro, Mary Skelter is a dungeon RPG, meaning that you're going to be going through dungeons in first person with exploration, fighting turn-based battles, going back and forth from the dungeon to your base for customization. The basic dungeon RPG formula is here. Now obviously your main point is to clear dungeons, and dungeons are unique in this game because they're all interconnected like one giant dungeon. You go through the city streets dungeon, and you got exits to the graveyard dungeon and the temple dungeon. Go into the graveyard dungeon and you'll find an exit to the tower. It's like the areas were in games like Mega Man ZX or Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. Now actual dungeon exploration is simple and it's got some unique features too. You just go grid to grid as you explore this dungeon, interact with objects, and get involved in turn-based battles. But character abilities and dungeon emotions mix things up a little bit. There are a lot of different hurdles that you have to get past. There are vines that you have to cut down. There are cracked walls that you have to bomb to open up new paths. And with every new character that you recruit, you gain abilities to be able to get past these. Now some of these are required for the story, while others you can go back to on previous dungeons and find much deeper floors to be able to kind of explore, level, and all around prepare you for the next story event. Dungeon emotions are a little bit more interesting. There are 3 different emotional shifts that a dungeon can go through as you're exploring it. When each of these emotional shifts happen, various bonuses will come up. Some of the bonuses are good for you, some of the bonuses are negative. There are also little emotion items that you can find in the dungeons. That way you can manipulate this system. So if you're about to go into a boss fight, you want to manipulate the emotions to give you a nice little bonus to make the boss fight easier. Now let's talk about characters and combat. Since this isn't like Demon Gaze, there is no character creation system. All of the story recruitable characters have different classes that they can go into. That way, if you get Thumbelina in your party and you don't want her to be a spellcaster with all your main spells, you can just level her up a bit, change her job to, say, an archer, and then, boom, she's your archer. And combat is a little bit unique as well. The basics of combat is pretty standard, just turn-based battles. You choose attack, skill, item, guard, etc. But the added strategy comes in the form of the corruption system. As the Blood Maiden playable characters fight off enemies, they will become corrupted, and if the corrupted comes too high, they will enter a berserk state. Now, the first part of the berserk state is very useful in battle, because they will not attack your party, and they will have higher stats. If they go up to the second tier, called Blood Skelter, they will become completely berserk, and will start one-shotting enemies and allies alike. Your main strategy here is what you want to risk, because the main character does have an ability that allows you to purge the corruption from one of your characters. We'll talk about length in just a second, but one thing I do want to go into is the fan service minigame that the game has. When you go back to your base and you want to lower corruption, you unlock a minigame to be able to rub blood on the girls. This is pretty much exactly like the torture minigame from the Criminal Girls series. It shows them in a sexual pose while you rub blood on them while they make sexual moans. Now, these fan service sections are optional. They'll give you buffs, and you can skip them after you do them once. But every time I saw them pop up, I thought, why was this needed? The game's plot, all of the story cutscenes, none of it really raise a fan service factor. So every time I saw these, I just thought, why was this needed? It wasn't needed. Why is this in here? It's just fan service for the sake of having fan service. Now let's talk about length. If you play on the easy or normal difficulties, where you won't have nearly as much grinding to do, the game can easily last 30 to 40 hours. That's counting story progression, the grinding, for the difficulty spikes, and not a whole lot else. Now let's talk about presentation. Visually, dungeon RPGs are mostly 2D, but Compile Hard has been mixing things up. Mayq from Idea Factory International had 3D sprites instead of 2D sprites, and so does Mary Skelter. In fact, the entire dungeon that you explore is 3D. If you take a moment and stop when you're exploring a dungeon, you'll see all kinds of 3D renders, 3D effects going on the walls, and when you go into battle, all enemies have 3D sprites. It's really just them kind of mixing up the formula, because almost all other dungeon RPGs only have 2D sprites in them. So it's a nice little change. And I don't really have any problems with the performance. Load times are quick, frame rate stays steady throughout the entire game, optimization is good. In conclusion, Mary Skelter is a fun little dungeon RPG with a darker tone that the genre really doesn't dive into much. While there is a fan service feature that really feels out of place, the game's art style, the unique features, and the interesting story will be plenty to draw in RPG fans. Reviews to Go rates Mary Skelter Nightmares a 9 out of 10. If you'd like to comment on this further, feel free to below, or head to the website at www.reviewstogo.com.